Assalamu alaikum. My name is Robert McCaw. I am the Government Affairs Director with the Council on American Islamic Relations, and this is CAIR on the Air. This is episode 2 of our September 11th retrospective series, and today's episode is focused on civil rights violations and foreign wars following the events of September 11th. For our first part, we have a guest that can directly speak to the issues of the federal government's overreach in a post September 11th landscape, speaking to the issues of profiling, detainment, surveillance, and other harms caused by the federal government's response. So, joining us first is Sister Adama Bah, and she is an author and activist. In 2005, when she was 16, she was detained by the FBI and the Homeland Security for allegedly overstaying her visa, and then they accused her of being a potential suicide bomber. Her father was deported, and she was put on the no-fly list and won a court case to get off of it. She wrote a book about her experiences called Accused: My Story of Injustice. So I would advise everyone to purchase that book and learn her story. But first, you can learn it here. So I want to welcome again Sister Adama Bah to our program.
Hello, assalamu alaikum, everyone.
Walaikum assalam. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your story today.
Thank you for having me.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
So where are you based right now?
I'm in New York City, in the Bronx.
Okay. Well, you know, it's really important that we have these really honest and frank conversations about the civil rights impacts and the violations that took place post post 9/11. And your story, Accused, my story of injustice and what you went through, I think every American Muslim and every American should know. So I really want to thank you for joining our program.
Thank you. I often say it's the narrative that's not told after 9/11. It's stories like mine.
It, absolutely. It's narratives that continue to this day when you look at government overreach and what's even happening today with the watch list. But you were one of the first to be impacted by this. So could you go back and recount your experience and tell us what happened in 2005?
Sure. So in 2005, I was 16 years old. Our apartment was stormed by NYPD, FBI, and immigration. I don't recall any other agencies that were there. Again, I was 16 years old. Um, I was detained. I was taken downtown to Federal Plaza where I was interrogated by FBI, CIA, NYPD, and they just questioned me about places and people that I didn't know about.
Now, just for our viewers, I want to let them know that in the weeks and months following 9/11 and even years later, it would still happen. But in the weeks after 9/11, nearly 800 American Muslims were detained. Now, these could have been US citizens, these could have been residents, these could have been immigrants studying here, hoping to get their green card, starting the process of the American dream. And all of that was halted when, like Sister Adma, they were detained by the FBI, the Department of Justice, local police. We know the CIA for years was working with the NYPD and really actually has done so all the way back to the time when they arrested the guards of Malcolm X just days before he was assassinated. So this has gone on for a very long time of Muslim surveillance in New York and detainment after 9/11. Did the authorities ever explain to you why they detained you?
So I remember once I was in Federal Plaza, the officer said I was also detained with another young lady named Tashnuba, and they said that she had put me on a list to become a suicide bomber. You know, my first reaction was, "There's a list," and then the second thing is like, "Why would she put me on the list?" Later on, we found out they told her the same thing, that I had put her on the list, and so they really never gave us a reason. They just told us that we were undocumented. And that's why we're going through this, because we were detained by immigration, and of course FBI came in and took advantage of that situation and interrogated us and did their investigation.
Oh, thank you for sharing that part. Can you tell us how this incident then affected you and your family?
Oh yeah, it's not just me and my family; it's my community.
Sure.
Everyone gets impacted when someone is removed. So I am the oldest out of five siblings. So all my siblings were, I believe, like 8 and younger. The youngest was like 3 months old, and so they're minors. They can't do much. My mom barely spoke any English. We relied on our community to help us. And I think at this time, a lot of Muslims were afraid to be associated with me and to kind of be involved in the situation. It was a lot of the Black Muslims who knew what we were going through that really got involved and were like, we know this sister is innocent. They've been doing this to our community for years. Um, my father was eventually deported, but it took a lot of emotional, physical, mental health that for to be traumatized like these. These are the people that are swore to protect us, and they're hurting us.
And you mentioned community earlier, and the African Muslim diaspora in New York was being heavily surveilled by the NYPD in conjunction with the CIA. We now know that through Adam Opuzzo's good writing with the AP. But at that time, when the community knew they were being watched, what was their response?
So it to be honest and be frank, it depends on your ethnic background. Um, when you're from an Arab community, I am a Black woman, so they're kind of hesitant to get involved because they're like, we don't know the whole story, we don't want to be investigated. And to be honest, a lot of these mosques were being investigated themselves for no apparent reason. So it took me a while to understand their fear, but now that I am an adult, I do understand that.
It must have been so tough as a teenager going through that, seeing the government target your own caretakers, your family, who are here to supposed to protect you. In this case, you're kind of left to protect yourself without as much community support. But you did persevere to an extent. So can you tell us about your placement on the watch list and how you successfully um, had your name, stricken from the watch list in court?
So actually, I was on a no-fly list, and they eventually told us, "Listen, if you drop out of the lawsuit, we'll take you off." It was a class action lawsuit that ACLU filed. I forgot how many individuals were on there, but you had veterans who were stuck overseas. You had American citizens who weren't allowed to be able to return back home, and then you had me. I didn't do anything. I was just trying to fly to Texas and to Chicago just for vacation. Um, and eventually they said, hey, if you drop out, we'll remove your name off the list. Um, so I think for me it was an easier process than a lot of people. But I didn't. You're placed on these lists and you don't even know it. How I found that I was on a no-fly list, I tried to board an airplane and was humiliated. I was met with guards and National Guards, police officers, dogs, and it was pretty embarrassing and traumatic.
And again, for the viewers, just through what CARE has learned through our own litigation, when law enforcement, whether that is a cop scanning your license plate, would trigger something through then a federal database, and they said this person's on the watch list and they're a suspected terrorist, a person's life is in danger when they are engaging with law enforcement and they have very limited information. They have no information on why a person is supposedly placed on the watch list, what their current activities were. The watch list, in part, is actually an information gathering tool where they're on that list, so people keep on running into law enforcement, so that the watch list is updated with their information. It's a way of keeping tabs on people. And again, if you're in the airport, these officers were going to act very aggressive because all they saw was your name on a list of potential terrorists with no information other than that. So, I'm glad that you were safe in this situation, because that's very, it's a horrible ordeal for anyone to go through. Um, and also the government, they were trying to get you off the case, and with that promise, if you drop out, you know what they do now? They
What?
actually just they remove you from the watch list in the middle of the lawsuit, or right in the beginning of the lawsuit, so the government can say this client shouldn't even be a client. They're not even on the watch list. So that's
And then they place you on another list
yeah,
because
they always do.
are you familiar with CARP? Because I was on CARP for a while.
Yes. Yes,
And
no, we're very familiar.
I didn't know until I went for my citizenship, and I'm like, I see everything redacted, CARP stamped everywhere, and I'm like, what is CARP?
So, going into that though, a little, just diving a little bit deeper, can you talk about your success in court then?
Sure. So I've been in the United States since I was 2 years old. So I always consider myself an American, but legally I wasn't. I found out I was undocumented when I was 16. So from the 16 years old to 33 years old, I have been in immigration court fighting. I literally went through the whole entire immigration system. I was granted asylum in 2007, green card around 2009, and just a month ago, I was granted citizenship. Uh,
Brooke.
yeah, I was in court for 7 years fighting to get my citizenship. And they kept saying, you're not of good moral character, despite all the amazing work that myself and many other individuals have helped me with. Um, and finally, they realized, listen, we're not going to win in this court case. Let's just give her citizenship. And me winning that citizenship just proved my innocence. For anyone out there who doubted my story, for anyone out there who doubted my innocence, I just received the highest oath. I committed to the highest oath and the highest status of becoming an American citizen.
In your lawsuit, were you challenging CARP itself, which is, of course, the Controlled Application Review and Resolution Program? Was that a part of the holdup of your citizenship? Because my spouse, got their green card, and 2 years later, citizen. That process didn't happen for you, even though you were in this country for years longer.
Yeah. So we didn't challenge a CARP. I know ACLU is doing a class action lawsuit, so we just did an individual lawsuit. Um,
Okay.
because, like I said, I've been waiting for 16 years to get my citizenship, and 7 years in that process, and within that 16 years. And so when we filed this lawsuit, they replied to us less than 2 weeks. We were like, that's a pretty quick response. Um,
Well, the government doesn't like moving until you sometimes force them in court, and then they really don't want to reveal why they were being so slow in the first place.
But it's messed up because, I work with the community, and there's so much resources, manpower were just used on me. That resources and manpower could have gone to our community and protecting and providing resources to our community. But no, we wanted to spend it on me.
Having gone through this, and obviously your citizenship delay, your placement on the watch list, the deportation of your father, that was all part of the securitization of American Muslims. And as you said, just recently you were given your citizenship after fighting for it. I mean, you want to be an American citizen. You are an American citizen. Um, how do you see securitization of American Muslims today? How much progress has actually been made?
I don't think it has made any progress. I think we just exposed it more. Um, Now we have proof because now I from the work of CAIR and ACLU and other organizations, now we have actual documents proving that we've been surveilled. But I don't think it's going to end. We have this narrative and this fear of Muslims that we can only eradicate it by educating our communities and telling stories like my story, that we are victims and we continue to be victims if you don't stop this.
I think that last part's really important, that American Muslims are being victimized by ongoing national security programs, but we can stop it if we can stand up and challenge it, and if we can work together. And it looks like you have obviously challenged a portion of this system, and you were successful in doing that. You did write a book, "Accused: My Story of Injustice." Uh, what could the viewer learn from this book?
So the book goes more into details about what happened the day of my arrest, the aftermath, and things leading up to now. I think that people think, oh well, she was released, so she must be fine. She didn't get accused of anything else. But you're traumatized after that. Um, my innocence was taken away from me. I was exposed to things that I should have never been, and now it's my job to make sure other people are not impacted the same way. So I've decided to advocate. And sometimes the best way to advocate is by sharing your story. And writing a book was one of the best ways. That's why the book is geared more to the youth. Um, I was a minor when this happened. There was no really kind of protocols of what to do if your student gets accused of terrorism or how to support someone that has been accused of terrorism. But now there is by telling my story and by the work that CAIR does.
Well, I really appreciate that. Do you have a message for American Muslims or for authorities? Where do you see things going next then for the community?
I think one of the biggest things I always tell people is, they use their laws. The same laws that I've used to get my freedom is the same laws that they use to hurt me. Learn a law, learn your rights, educate yourself, and solidarity is very important. I didn't do this alone. I had so many people helping me and supporting me. And it's important if you need help, reach out. Do not be afraid. You have rights. And I always tell people do not speak to law enforcement. I don't care what they tell you. Do not speak to them without an attorney.
I'm not an attorney. That's really important. Uh, you're still in the Bronx. You're active in the Muslim community. I converted in 2004, and so and my experience is a lot different than other Muslims, and I know that, and I try to make the best of whatever circumstances there are out there to improve the condition of the American Muslim community. What have you seen change in the Bronx in the past 20 years in both your community and the surrounding Muslim community, in how they're politically organizing, how they're voting, how they're standing up for themselves?
There has been a lot of grassroots organizations that have been rising up around the city. And I think one of the biggest things is that we're communicating more with each other. We're providing more support. I know with me, I'm working with MCN right now, which is Muslim Community Network, with their Excluded Workers Fund. And it's been amazing that I'm able to connect other organizations that I've worked with and say, listen, this is what I'm trying to do. Can you guys support me? They're like, yeah, I'll help you. All the mosques in around the city are actually allowing me to use their space for free to allow undocumented immigrants to come in and fill out this application. And we want them to feel safe. And we understand the fear and the fight that undocumented immigrants are going through, and we're willing to protect them. So I'm seeing a lot of unity, and I think that's amazing.
I think that's great. I was having lunch with someone from Ikna Relief, and they work with undocumented immigrants, and the local branch is working out here in Baltimore. And it's undocumented immigrants. There are Muslims, by the way, who are undocumented immigrants, but these are Muslim spaces opening themselves up for non-Muslims, and showing that charity that is inherent in our religion, and realizing we're part of a broader network of people. Can you tell me just a little bit more about that work, because I'm always really interested to hear about how Muslims are taking their experiences or their community asset spaces and helping our other immigrant allies.
Sure. So the Excluded Workers Fund, it was a bunch of activists and lawyers who got together because during COVID, undocumented immigrants did not qualify for stimulus check, any government assistance they did not qualify for. But these are human beings. These are mothers, children who have rent due, and so this money's out. There's two amounts. One is 15,600. The other amount is 3,200, and I needed a space to host my immigrants so that they feel safe. I knew I could do it at a church, and I knew I could do it at my local community center, but I wanted the mosque to do it because we need to start allowing non-Muslims in our mosque and showing this is who we are. You are also safe in our space. You are welcome in our space. Um, this can be your sanctuary. So we have hubs around all over the city. So it's been amazing to connect with other Muslim communities, see how many programs they have for youth services, marriage services. And it's like, wow, okay, you guys have a lot of things going on, even pantries that they're hosting.
Well, I think the fact that you can take what trauma you had as an immigrant, learn and grow from it, fight the system, and then work with the local community to make sure we're not just serving the needs of immigrant Muslims, but all immigrants and undocumented immigrants in New York City it's a really great story to hear the progress of the story of your life. And if I would ask my viewers, if you're interested in what we just talked about now and you'd like to learn more about these experiences, please pick up Sister Adama Bah's book, Accused: My Story of Injustice. Do you know where the viewers can get that book?
They can actually get it anywhere a book is sold: Amazon, Barnes and Noble. I know there's a bunch of other bookstores, but those are the well-known ones.
Okay. Well, everyone, please check out this book again. And we always like asking this question: if we could put this up on the a big billboard right now, and you had one message to share, what is that?
Ah, that's hard because lately it's been a lot, but I guess
Oh, if I could buy you 5 billboards.
deal. I think heal. Take time to heal. I think it's very important
Absolutely.
because even though I'm out here in the community, I'm hearing trauma, and sometimes hearing trauma can cause trauma. So I always have to remind myself I'm my passion is from my experience, but I have to take time so that I'm not burnt out and heal.
All right. I think that's a very powerful and resonating message. If people want to get in contact with you, follow you on social media, where can they find you?
It's my name, Adama Bah. I keep my social media public so that that's actually where a lot of undocumented immigrants reach out to me from all over the country. So if you want to contact me on Facebook or Instagram, you're more than welcome. Twitter, same thing, same name.
All right. Well, everyone, please, thank Sister Alma Ba for sharing her story. Please visit her social media. Please check out her book. We'll be entering our second segment in just a few minutes. But in the meantime, thank you so much for joining us, Sister. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you, Brother Robert.
All right, great. And we'll put up our graphic, and we're just going to get ready for our next guest. We're going to talk about the forever wars, the impact of America's foreign war and foreign policy post 9/11. We've just withdrawn from Afghanistan. We have withdrawn or slowed down our troops in Iraq, and we're here to talk about the long-term effects of the forever wars on America as well as overseas. So just stay tuned. 1 minute, we'll be back in action. Thank you for joining us again. For those that just jumped into our program, this is episode 2 of our September 11th retrospective series. Today's episode is focused on civil rights violations and foreign wars. We just concluded our first part focusing on civil rights violations, and now we're jumping into foreign wars. So I want to bring on 2 guests. Our first guest is Sara Haghdoosti as the deputy director and senior strategist. Uh, and as senior strategist, Sara helps with all aspects of Win Without Wars activities. I might add an organization CAIR has worked with and signed on to for a number of causes. And she has a specific focus on campaign strategy. She's a writer, organizer, strategist who's been working on social campaigns around the world for over a decade with organizations including Get Up Australia, Change.org, and the Mozilla Foundation. Sara has driven campaigns for climate and reproductive justice, peace, and tech accountability. She's founded BERIM.org, which is BERIM.org, which is Let's Go in Farsi. And she's helped bring over 70,000 people together to push for diplomacy with Iran. At Mozilla, Sara helped take the campaigns team from being a single person to a thriving department that helped Mozilla push corporations to take responsibility for security instead of passing it off to consumers. And Sara's campaigning background includes field organizing, digital and legislative advocacy, and designing technology to help people take action. She's in the business of empowering. Sara currently lives outside of Chicago with her family and is also a passionate writer and currently working on her first novel. Good luck with that, from everyone that aspires to be a novelist one day. Our second guest is Dr. Stephanie Savell. Dr. Savell is the project director on Brown University's Cost of Wars project, an anthropologist of militarism, security, and civic engagement, and has studied these topics in the United States and Brazil. Her primary research is on the United States post 9/11 wars, on militarized police and Rio de Janeiro festivals. Dr. Savell has also published in Polar, the Political and Legal Anthropology Review, Focal, the Journal of Global and Historical Anthropology, The Guardian, and the Smithsonian Magazine, Axios, The Nation, among others. And she's a co-author of the Civic Imagination, Making a Difference in American Political Life. And she's earned a PhD from Brown University. So first off, Dr. Savell, Ms. Haghdoosti, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
And I got everyone's name correct?
Sara, not Sara.
All right. Thank you so much. It's always a guessing game with Sara. All right. So I just, number one, I know Win Without Wars work, CAIR has been partnering on that type of work since the very beginning of being opposed to the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq. This has been a long haul, but we're getting towards the end, which is, I think, good for everybody. I have a lot of questions. I just kind of want to pose them to both of you since you're such experts in organizing in these fields. So either feel free to both tackle the question or just one of them if you want, but can I just throw a bunch of questions at you because I'm really interested in Americans' foreign policy and the anti-war movement and how war has really affected America and those overseas.
Sounds awesome.
Yeah,
all right, great. I'm just going to jump right into it. So how was America pulled into the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq? And what were the American people told which led us into these wars? These didn't happen overnight. They didn't happen at the same time. But yet, within a 3-year period, we were in both countries. Could you both kind of, when you jump in and walk us through and add to how did we get there and what lies were we told to get there?
Sara, do you want to take this one first?
Sure. I think 20 years ago, there was a tremendous tragedy. And while people were grieving, they were lied to. And some of those lies are infamous now. We have all heard about the lies around weapons of mass destruction and how that really helped pave the way for a lot of these wars. I think the point that's less commonly made, though, is that those lies were also built on a really big foundation of falsehoods. And those foundations of falsehoods included things like the US as being incapable of doing wrongdoing, which we know isn't true, that the lives of people overseas matter less, that there is a possibility to win these things where there really isn't. And by engaging in these kinds of wars, we ultimately end up making everyone less safe. The other thing I want to pull in here is both before these wars and during them, there's been this real foundational falsehood around people who are in the Middle East or in Muslim countries don't understand democracy, don't want it. And there's been such little reckoning with the role the US and other countries have played in very deliberately undermining democratic efforts in those countries. So, yes, there's been the falsehoods around weapons of mass destruction that we're all familiar with. But I also really want to make the point that these endless wars that we've seen over the last 20 years weren't a failure of the system. They were the system working exactly as it's been designed to. And that's part of the reason why we were drawn into these engagements.
I remember back in the early 2000s that after we invaded Iraq, we were waiting to invade Syria. And, that was a popular conversation on the college campus among academics and in the news about, well, if it works in Iraq, are we going to Syria next? And we can see the quagmire that Syria would have been even without us, as their own people struggled and were fighting for democracy. And so thank you for the insight into that. What were the objectives of America's missions in Afghanistan and Iraq? Were they ever clearly defined? Did we know how we were going to get out? Did our policy makers ever intend to have these accomplished, or were they just trusting on the military and the presidency to do their thing?
Yeah, I can answer that. So the U.S. invaded Afghanistan to topple the Taliban, and the U.S. invaded Iraq to topple Saddam Hussein's regime. And then in both cases, after those initial official missions were accomplished, the U.S. stayed to quote unquote stabilize the country. And, researchers have written about what was really going on here, because as Sara was saying, there were a lot of kind of falsehoods that were told to the American public, and the American public was feeling a lot of fear and really approved a very proactive military stance at that point. But basically, if you take a step back and look at the way that, terrorism is most effectively addressed, and like historical cases have shown that, it's not through a military solution. In fact, a combination of policing and kind of getting at the root causes of people's grievances and why they join militant groups in the first place and commit these acts of violence. A lot of times it has to do more with, anger and despair at poverty and lack of opportunity and frustration with the state. So that's a more effective way. This war on terror approach and the war paradigm approach to dealing with the problem of terrorism was something that the U.S. kind of jumped in with, starting with, President Bush and Donald Rumsfeld and Cheney. These guys had a real agenda that they were pushing, which was to basically demonstrate that that U.S. could lead the world through its military might. And so they really were kind of testing out this theory that they had, this belief that they had in what they called preventative war or preemptive war, and the fact that the U.S. could go in and prevent future attacks on the U.S. homeland through actions abroad. And that understanding, that preemptive war, was really incredibly misguided. And I'm sure we're going to talk more about that. But really, it was about removing these regimes that Washington deemed odious. It was about believing in military assertiveness as a foundation of American global order. And it was about establishing a neoliberal order in the Islamic world through such kind of empty, really key phrases as democracy and women's rights and, you know, limited government and all those kinds of things. It's really about kind of spreading you know, kind of neoliberal capitalist worldview.
Thank you for sharing that. 20 years onward from the events of 9/11, just this January, we saw a number of far right, white supremacists in many cases, you know, individuals stormed the U.S. Capitol, and they did so saying that this was like an uber act of patriotism. They were insurrectionists. This was an act of terrorism. This was a threat to our own democracy and continues to be. I actually view this as an extension of the this jingoistic pseudo patriotism that came about not after 9/11, but years later as politicians are trying to harness the fear and the upsetness of Americans into a very far right political agenda. And I ask myself, and I'll ask in three parts, what were the effects of these wars on the American people? What have been the effects of these wars on the people in Iraq and separately in Afghanistan? And, you know, how has this affected the world order today? And it's a big question. I mean, you could write a whole book on that. I know, but
I'll just start by giving an overview of some of the Cost of War Project's research. So we're a research group. We're not an activist group, actually. And what we do is provide research for, you know, the peace movement and people who are can use our work to what we say is kind of question and challenge the militarized status quo in this country. And so what our research has shown is that the U.S. has spent $8 trillion in spent and obligated funds on the post 9/11 wars since 2001. This is Afghanistan and Iraq, but it's also you know, Pakistan, Syria, and some others, the post 9/11 war zones. Those wars, that kind of broader umbrella of war, has directly caused 929,000 deaths. So 929,000 people have died as a direct result of, you know, what we say is bombs and bullets and fire and shrapnel. And at least several times as many more have died due to the reverberating effects of war, the continuing effects of war in the war zones that the civilians in the war zones are going to face for decades to come. And this is everything from, you know, environmental contamination to the destruction of healthcare systems to, you know, unexploded ordnance that dots the Afghan land to wrecked sewage and increased disease, and the displacement of 38 million people from their homes and livelihoods.
Can you jump a little bit into just that 900,000 figure? Is that, you know, people just killed by U.S. munitions or directly by the U.S. military or U.S. military allies, or just the conflicts that ensued from the invasion? And please break that number down a little bit more.
The latter, yeah, it's people who have died in these conflicts. It would be impossible to track, you know, who's died by U.S. Munitions, but there's different categories of people involved. Oftentimes, the U.S. public is really focused on service members who do certainly make a huge sacrifice for this country. About 7,052 service members have died compared to that 929,000. So the proportion is it's a vast amount more people in other parts of the world. So we include civilian counts from the UN and other organizations. We include military contractors. We include militants, people, fighters on, you know, who the Afghan and Iraqi governments might categorize as you know, the opposition fighters. And it's important to do that because who gets counted as a civilian is actually really a political question. There's a lot of incentive for the people who are counting the death toll to categorize people as, militants or fighters rather than civilians. And also just because, every life matters, and every life lost is creates a ripple of mourning and in its wake. So
the phrase military aged male, it can quite often just be a civilian on a walking path that was hit by a drone strike.
right.
Sarah, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to lean into my novelist side a little bit. I think
Please.
when you hear those kinds of figures, and like especially when people are described as civilians, it's easy to forget they're people. Their families, they're people who had dreams and inspirations and communities that are fundamentally not the same. And the amount of potential we've lost as a result of those wars in those areas that could have been fighting climate change, that could have been creating amazing literature, is truly staggering. So I want to name that. I also want to share, like, I was born in Iran. I'm part of the Muslim community as well. I was part of the generation that got radicalized with the Iraq War. That was my very first protest that I ever attended. The amount of people who have been called terrorists, either jokingly or have been, that's things they've had to deal with. The amount of we've seen our community face at airports and other walks of their lives is phenomenal. And the other part of this that I want to name is so much of this conversation, and even recently with the withdrawal of Afghanistan, you see the voices that are anti-war or the people who are most impacted locked out of these discussions. And they're, especially if you are from these communities, your expertise not valued as being a foreign policy expert, where so many of us have experienced a firsthand impact of these decisions, know what it costs our communities, know what it costs, takes away from all the other important things we could be doing. And it is so important to make sure that we can help change that we can have anti-war voices at the forefront of these discussions, and we can have people who are most impacted by these decisions to also be at the forefront of those discussions, as opposed to people who are weapons manufacturers or defense contractors, or who have a history of supporting truly abhorrent policy decisions.
Speaking to people's first political experiences, there's a whole generation of people following the events of 9/11 that you were either pro-war or anti-war. And I've seen these conversations just continue to today. And it's been formative. And I really want to know what is shaping the next 20 years of, anti-war activism. Did we learn any lessons? Can we prevent this again? Or, Muslim political activism of, we're still being securitized. Here are these lasting programs still in effect. I think we're all going to be busy for the next 20 years, regardless. But, thank you again for that insight. We're here 20 years later. The war in Afghanistan has been objectively lost. America's mission in Iraq was a disaster that led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. With there still being instability and fractionalization in that country today because of the U.S. involvement. Do you think our policymakers have learned anything? Because I just talked about we're going to be busy for the next 20 years trying to make sure this mess doesn't happen again. It will inevitably happen again in some way. But, what have U.S. policymakers learned? Where are we today?
Well, I just want to say you're absolutely right. The war in Afghanistan was a catastrophic failure. President Biden was absolutely right to end it. And there is still so much work to be done. I want to just reiterate I think the system, our current status quo, is geared to war. That's just the way it functions. We still know that defense contractors and manufacturers have way too much power when it comes to DC. We're still not seeing the kind of vigorous debate we need to be seeing in order to truly help stop this from happening. And I think it's up to all of us to really help push for those changes. And I will also say it's such a clear illustration that the biggest threats we're facing right now don't have military solutions. When it comes to climate change, when it comes to rising inequality, when it comes to the erosion of our democracy, you mentioned what happened in January. Those things do not have military solutions, and it's really time that we started cutting the Pentagon budget and instead investing in things that are really going to see true dividends for people in our communities.
Dr. Savell?
I think that was really well said, Sara. And I would just add that, the Pentagon and kind of U.S. security strategists are talking about great power competition with Russia and China. It's just the latest excuse for U.S. militarism abroad. So if it's not counterterrorism, it's the next thing, and it's that kind of the roots of that way of thinking, of approaching foreign policy problems with a militarized angle. That's kind of the root of the problem, really. As Sara was saying, this like really incredibly overinflated Pentagon budget. And, the post 9/11 wars themselves, the counterterror mission is still continuing in so many ways. I mean, something that people don't talk enough about either is the fact that, while US troops have withdrawn from Afghanistan, we're still conducting counterterror operations in 85 countries, including Afghanistan, through CIA drone strikes and support of local militia groups. And there are all kinds of, and arms sales and bases and defense contractors. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that the US is kind of like honing in and doubling down on a so-called light footprint approach that minimizes the violence to US soldiers and increases the potential violence to civilians abroad. So, it absolutely is more important than ever that we continue to hold our government accountable for these kinds of activities and don't just kind of rest with the false notion that the post 9/11 wars are over.
They're not, and you brought up the prospect of drone warfare, and I always, you hear that that fallacy of an argument that our troops were over there, so they can't attack us here, like our troops were some type of sacrificial pawn, which they should never be. But now we are killing people from afar using drones. How is that not these indiscriminate killings, which lead to civilian violence, as we just saw in Afghanistan, where a family was mistaken for, I guess, ISIL-K. A whole family was wiped out just a week and a half ago. We're not even talking about it anymore because of just bad drone warfare policy. Where do you see the Biden administration in the evolution of drone warfare in, a post-Afghanistan, 20 years post 9/11 environment?
I think the subject of drone warfare is one that still needs a lot of advocacy and a lot of pushing. Like, yes, what we're seeing is not okay. And we don't want to see endless wars. Endless wars aren't going to stop if there's still drone warfare happening. And I think when we're talking about lessons of the last 20 years, the other thing I really want to pull out here is that I think a lot of people fell into the trap of thinking that just because something's happening over there, that it's never going to come back. And what we've seen is when you have a hugely inflated Pentagon budget and they're sending weapons to Afghanistan, to Iraq, they end up coming back here as well and fueling police departments here. We're seeing technologies like advanced facial recognition that don't work, that start off as military programs and then are used here in the US as well. This notion that things are that clear cut and that separate, I think we've seen over the last 20 years that it's just not true. And those weapons don't belong in Afghanistan, they don't belong in Iraq, and they don't belong on the streets of Chicago or Baltimore or anywhere else in this country as well. And I think that's the thing I want to pull out, that we need to really start talking about these issues in the way that they are interconnected, and how when we allow the rights of people who are outside of the US to be trampled, we really pave the way for our own rights here to be eroded as well.
Thank you. So, rounding down the conversation to, I guess, the last question, what policies should our lawmakers or our administration be adopting in our own foreign policy, at least for the next 4 to 8 years under this administration?
I'll just say I'm not a policy expert like Sara is, but we need to put people at the center of our foreign policy decision making, and not operate under misguided myths that wars are quick, cheap, or even effective. Wars in general are incredibly counterproductive. This war, the post 9/11 wars, is a case in point. There are more quote unquote terrorist groups today than there were on 9/11. There's more recruits to those groups every day. And US violence is a big contributor to recruitment. And it's a big cause of the very violence we say we addressed. And this is just a case study of how, a failure to kind of center humans and make that a kind of, humanity-based oriented foreign policy decision making is just not only morally reprehensible, but also incredibly counterproductive. We're not keeping Americans or anyone else safer through a US war on terror.
Not at all. Sara?
Could not agree more. I think, and if we're looking at specifics, cutting the Pentagon budget, it makes no sense that the Pentagon budget is where it's at while the country is going through a pandemic, while we're seeing such rising income inequality. So seeing that is important. We need to stop selling weapons to human rights abusers around the world. That feels like a very basic thing that should just stop. And beyond that, we need to really start investing in people-centered foreign policy and addressing the real challenges we face. And the US is not going to be able to solve climate change by itself. We need to start actually talking to other countries, engaging in multilateralism, and tackling things like climate change and adopting policies like the Green New Deal to actually be able to give our children and the next generation the world they deserve.
Absolutely. Those are two really good billboard statements that we always ask our guests to contribute as we wind down the program. Sara, Stephanie, Dr. Savell, thank you so much for joining today's program, for joining your expertise and insights to our audience about really what were the forever wars that we're trying to bring to an end, but there always seems to be another chapter. It's going to take the activism of every American to, fight this interventionist foreign policy that's just become a part of our culture. We hope to have you both on as guests in the future to have more conversations about this, especially if it's in a preventative measure to stop this type of engagement. So I want to thank you both for joining our program today. And we definitely look forward to having you back on. And really quick, if people want to follow you, get in touch with you, how do they do that?
I'm on Twitter at at Steph Savell, and you can follow Costs of War on Facebook as well.
Great.
I'm on Twitter under Haghdoosti, and you can follow Win Without War at Win Without War.
All right. Thank you. And CAIR looks forward to continuing to partner with Win Without War on all its great projects that it's doing. So thank you.
So much.
Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you both.
Bye.
All right. Well, that's it for our second program that we hosted today as part of our September 11th retrospective series. Our first guest, we were able to talk about government overreach, civil rights, and violations that took place after the events of September 11th. Our next two guests we spoke with about what were the forever wars and really the disastrous U.S. policy that was in Afghanistan and Iraq. Tomorrow's program is titled Wave of Hate, where we are going to be exploring the wave of hate crimes that not only targeted Muslims, but other minorities throughout the U.S. following the events of September 11th. And whenever U.S. politicians found it beneficial for them to whip up a frenzy of hate for another election and some cheap, easy votes. So tomorrow's program, again, is Wave of Hate. That will be episode 3 of our September 11th retrospective series. It'll be airing at 1 o'clock. I want to thank all our viewers that watched us today, and please join us tomorrow. So thank you. Assalamu alaikum.